Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Is the economy recovering, or is the economy itself the problem? Today on the show, Marxist philosopher David Harvey on what he calls money, the great corrupter. And later, a meeting of movements as activists from Black Lives Matter travel to Palestine. All that and a few thoughts from me on Greek charisma. It's all coming up. I've long believed that few things in the world were less well understood than the U.S. economy. In our global media, the U.S. is still seen largely as an overwhelmingly affluent and successful place. Even if there are pockets of poverty, they're usually explained by race or gender or people not just trying hard enough. David Harvey has a very different take. Distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, Harvey believes it's not a few personal problems or pockets, it's the system that's the problem. And it's in much worse shape in the US and globally than you might think. Professor Harvey is out with a new book, 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, and I'm happy to say he's come in to discuss it. Glad to have you, David.
Thank you.
Growth is one of your crises, one of your contradictions, rather,
Yeah.
that you talk about in the book. There are several others that seem rather urgent. Want to talk about those?
I think the ones that to me are most significant are the growth issue, the environmental issue, and what I call universal alienation. The way in which we relate to each other, the way in which we relate to our jobs, the way in which we relate to the natural world around us is being constructed in a certain way through the dynamics of technological change and through the growth process, to the point where it's almost impossible to be really human in our relationships to people, in our relationships to life. And I think that there's a kind of sense of frustration, a tremendous sense of frustration. And you see this in the younger generation that looks at the future and says, where are the meaningful jobs? It's not only jobs. I mean, I get very tired when politicians go around and say, jobs, 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 jobs. You say, but yeah, but meaningful jobs. Right. A lot of the jobs right now, you know, and back in the say 1960s when I first came to the United States, the biggest employers were people like U.S. Steel, auto industry, and so on. And if you talk to a steel worker, they were kind of political and saw they were being exploited, but they had a certain sense of dignity in terms of the work they did and certain pride in it. The biggest employers now are no longer of that sort. They're Walmart, McDonald's, you know, and the rest of it. And you talk to people who were employed in that and say, do you feel this is dignified work? And they'll look at you and laugh. Okay. And about 70% of the population of the United States is either totally upset at the nature of the work it has to do or totally indifferent to it. And this is kind of a situation in which you get a kind of visceral anger. And what we've seen, by the way, over the last 20 or 30 years are these sudden outbreaks of visceral anger. In London, for example, suddenly the whole thing, you know, burnings go on. We saw it last year in Stockholm. We saw it in Gezi Park in Istanbul. We've seen these events in North Africa. In Brazil, millions of people out on the street complaining about the World Cup of soccer. I mean, what were they? Well, they're angry and alienated that somehow or other they cannot have a meaningful life and a decent living environment with decent employment opportunities. And so this sense of alienation is producing, at this point, not an alternative political movement, but outbreaks of fury and anger, which are actually very, very difficult to predict and very, very difficult to control.
What did we have before? We had commercialization and capitalization and alienation of ourselves from our labor and each other.
Well, I think there was this period during the 1930s, 1940s, and I don't think we should romanticize it, but there was this period where labor felt, I think, it was able to have a piece of the pie and could influence things, and there was a social net, a social safety net which was being constructed, a welfare state of sorts, which had a class character and had all kinds of things wrong with it. I mean, relationship to gender and race was absolutely awful, and so on. But nevertheless, there was a kind of sense that there was the possibility of a better future, and people felt that. And then in the 1970s, all of that began to get eroded and gradually washed away. And there was a time when people felt, well, being entrepreneurial is a good idea. We can all go out and be entrepreneurs and so on. And of course, some people did, and they made it, but a lot of people didn't. And increasingly, we got the production of more and more higher and higher levels of poverty. The income inequalities start to sort of spiral out of hand, and so we get this transformation. And then it produces, through the technological changes, the artificial intelligence, the robotization, and all the rest of it, then what we get is this kind of meaningless labor where people don't really understand what it is they're doing. A society which, by the way, is dedicated to be anti-government, but which is more bureaucratic than ever before. I mean, I work in a university. The levels of bureaucratic stuff we have to fill out to do anything is just enormous. And so, you know, we've got this system where I think that it's not working at any level.
And it's wrong in the fundamentals. I mean, in your book, you quote the wonderful Karl Polanyi, and you just used the word transformation.
Yes.
He goes further back. He says that the fundamentals are wrong. Yes. Our relationship to land, to labor, to capital is in itself wrong.
Yes.
What did he add to the Marxist picture?
Well, I don't know whether he added anything. I mean, I like Karl Polanyi precisely because he doesn't come out of the Marxist camp, but I think so much of what Marx talked about and Polanyi talks about is just common sense. Land is not a commodity that we've made. We've turned it into a commodity by establishing private property rights, and we're doing things on that sort with knowledge now. So knowledge, which should be a commons for everybody, is now being enclosed and actually I was stuck somewhere and I needed one of my own articles and I couldn't find a copy of it. I was traveling and I had to pay $25 in order to get it off the web. And I thought, here I am paying $25 for one of my own articles. This is ridiculous.
The cloud is not the commons.
No, it's not the commons. And so there's this privatization of everything, which has actually enclosed things, and I think it's increasingly done so. And of course what Polanyi is about is saying when land got enclosed that way, when labor, which is not a commodity either, gets commodified, and when capital is also becomes a commodity which you can charge interest on, then this is a wacky world. It's a fictitious world, and so capital has always been built on certain fictions. But now those fictions are coming home to roost, I think, and we saw those fictions really go haywire entirely in 2007, 2008.
If, though, to continue this for just a bit before we get back to the crisis, if, as you write and others have written, that in fact we have lost our community, that community has become commodities and money and exchange. You have a great line from Marx, I think, about money has become the only community. How do we undo it? How do we want to go back, forward, what?
No, we don't want to go back. We want to really start to think about how to go forward. And there are a lot of experiments going on right now of trying to say, all right, look, the social relations are terrible. Let's try and set up a solidarity economy. Let's try to set up worker cooperatives. Let's do what the Argentinians do, which is create recuperated factories, take over the factories for ourselves, do those kinds of things. So there are people, and you know, and there's of course a lot of argument going on about how to relate to the deep ecology movement and so on. Now, I don't necessarily think these are great movements in the sense that they head in a real coherent political direction. But what it says is that in a world where there's mass alienation from our relation to nature and relation to others, we're going to see responses which are not only outbreaks of fury and anger at the nature of the system, but also start to become, well, maybe locally you and I could sit down and start to construct something which is an alternative. So we're seeing a lot of that going on at various parts of the world. And in some cases, these experiments, I think, are actually sort of suggesting ways to go. So we see, for instance, in various areas of Latin America, the Bolivarian revolutions going on, and there's a lot wrong with it. But on the other hand, at least People are trying to find out new ways of relating, and they talk now, for instance, about this idea of buen vivir, good living, and that the idea of an economy is to create good living for everybody rather than to maximize GDP. And this is a kind of, I think, a significant shift in the mentality of how we approach questions of development and how we approach questions of reconstruction of urban and rural life.
Is it true amongst your students that you're finding a greater appetite for these conversations? And is the word capitalism and socialism, are those words being used?
Oh yes, well, amongst my students anyway, there's a good deal of criticism of capitalism. There's a good deal of, I think, interest in what might be called autonomous forms of organizing. So there's a great deal of suspicion of political parties. There's a great deal of suspicion about any appeal to state power and the like. But there are these sort of movements, I think, which I think it's wrong to call them anarchists because they're not. I mean, some of it is, but it's more about trying to create more sort of local democracy, local democratic decision-making structures, and I think this is a very, very healthy phase of innovation at that level. The big problem for me is how do we actually turn it into something which is much greater. And there is a very significant barrier, which is that, you know, to the degree that, for instance, the unions are no longer as strong as they are, and like you say, well, where are the main centres of political organisation right now, which are, quote, oppositional? And it's mainly, of course, through the non-governmental organisations. And non-governmental organisations are not revolutionary. Non-governmental organisations address questions of, I don't know, poverty or environment or something of that at a certain kind of scale, but they don't challenge the nature of the general order, because the general order is what funds them. So that we've got a sort of situation right now in which the main political institutions, through opposition expressed, are not actually able to mount a challenge to the hegemonic and dominant forms of power which are currently ruling the world.
Well, I did appreciate at the end of your 17 contradictions, you did have 17 suggestions, or maybe you called them mandates, I don't remember.
Yeah, right.
You want to articulate a few of those? Because you do lay out some clear suggestions.
Well, I think it's very, I mean, for instance, the first contradiction I deal with is a distinction between use value and exchange value. And I use the example of housing. Housing has a use value and it has an exchange value. And of course, there's a certain tension. If you want to maximize the exchange value, we can lose the use value. Now, we've been told that the best way in which to get the use values delivered to the mass of the population is to invent an exchange value structure, which allows mortgage financing and all kinds of things of that sort, private home ownership and all the rest of it, a whole structure of commodified world, which is very profitable for those people who are running it. So they get a profit, and we supposedly get the use values of the housing. Well, what we saw in the housing crisis was, I don't know, 6 million people lost their use values. And I'm kind of going, well, what we should be doing is thinking about a society that delivers use values to people directly, and doesn't have to go through this intermediary of the exchange value system from which a great deal of wealth is being extracted by small groups of people. And the same thing applies to education. Same thing applies to healthcare. It's a use value, it's useful, it should be there. Education should be useful, should be there. We should keep the exchange value dynamic out of it. So my suggestion is to everybody, maximize the use value provision character of the society, and think about how to organize the provision of those use values, and minimize the capacity of people to extract private wealth from an exchange value system, which occasionally blows up like it did in 2007, 2008, with disastrous consequences.
But is that different from the social welfare system that you grew up in UK?
Well, there was, yes, I think the nationalisation of healthcare and education. My education was free right the way through, and I had free healthcare. And I think that should be the case. And of course that gets eroded. Now, one of the difficulties, however, with something like the National Health Service in Britain was, while it was nationalised and in terms of what it was providing to people, it was preyed upon by a lot of private corporations. So there's a kind of a, there's always this awkward thing when you have a public organisation which is somehow or other existing in a sea of private entrepreneurial capital, which at some point or other starts to prey upon that as a kind of, turn it into a victim of its own designs.
So let your utopian visions run riot before we close. You're one who talks about our utopian desires and how we need to express them. Express them.
Well, I think one of them is, abolish the exchange value structures. Of course, exchange value also rests on something called money. And money is a great corrupter, as we know, of our desires and our needs. I mean, and we spend a lot of time worrying about money, desiring money, wanting money, and then you think to yourself, this is stupid. This is not a good life, to be kind of fetishistically sort of focusing on how much of this money I mean, this is crazy. Mm-hmm. So we then have to have as Thomas More in Utopia suggested, a moneyless economy. And he then said, in a moneyless economy, you would sleep very well at night. And I don't sleep very well at night, so I'm looking forward to a moneyless economy where we can all sleep very well at night.
All right, well, we'll sleep at night wondering how the heck we will ever get there when our politicians are in hock to the bankers.
Yes, right. No, well, this is one of the big things. Though there's lots of interesting things happening technologically now with money. I mean, electronic monies are beginning to, I think, erode the traditional monetary forms. So we're going to see a revolution in our monetary configuration coming down the pike. And one of the things I try to say to people on the left is, you've got to understand this is happening. We've got to make sure this is not orchestrated as a right-wing gesture, as happens with something like Bitcoin. Mm. And is there a way in which we on the left can actually construct an alternative monetary system which actually is much more democratic and which much more socially constructive?
Excellent. David Harvey, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
We came here to Palestine to stand in love and revolutionary struggle with our brothers and sisters. We come to a land that has been stolen by greed and destroyed by hate. We come here and we learn laws that have been co-signed in ink but written in the blood of the innocent. And we stand next to people who continue to courageously struggle and resist the occupation. People who continue to dream and fight for freedom. From Ferguson to Palestine, the struggle for freedom continues.
1, 2, 3, We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's won.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's won.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's won.
We sit in a sea of settlements while the sound of suffering sails lost in the listening as the voices of heartache hail. The power of presence, people as portals, passports to heaven. Here is a protest in the form of a prayer. God is in the holy water lining the lower lids of Ali's eyes. A tear, a river against a cheek. Waiting in old Jerusalem, sitting On a leaning chair in the market, the lonely storyteller God. God is a woman holding a crying baby in her arms at a checkpoint in Ramallah, waiting at the gates like cattle. God is in the rubble, gnarled hands rinsing in an open fire, a journey of dreamers singing through empty streets in Bethlehem. We survive in the telling, unafraid we survive in the telling, we survive. Watan badun shab wa shab badun watan. We survive.
What if occupation's a dream the Palestinians had? Krills underneath their teeth and they suddenly relapse. Saw the ships at the bay of the West Bank shore. Woke up and the occupation existed no more. What if Zionism is the second coming of Christ? Destruction is the matrimony in sight, because if we are the Messiah, then God is not white. What if life is the afterlife and we already dead? The footage of the moment replayed in your head, looping over until you die for the second time. What if power influence your intelligence and mind, and those with the lesser are really the oppressors, but you still steal this land under that pressure? Free Palestine.
Palestine to Ferguson in the occupation. Ferguson to Palestine, we fight to free our nations. Palestine to Ferguson in the occupation. Ferguson to Palestine, we fight to save our nation. Palestine to Ferguson in the occupation. Ferguson to Palestine, we fight to save our nation.
When it comes to elections, there's the who of politics and there's the what of it. What do parties and politicians actually do to win support? Well, they're not brilliant at the first. The money media in the US tend to be truly terrible at covering the latter. The historic election in Greece is a case in point. Read the US press and you'd gather the following. Greece's new Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, is its youngest ever at 40. He's far left, leftist, a leftist political maverick, a tough talker, and charismatic. Syriza, the party he leads, is usually called radical, far left, extremist, or some mix of all of those. So what's it to you? As Public Radio's Market Report put it on the eve of the vote, quote, the potentially massive repercussions of this weekend's election in a small corner of Europe is one more risk for the world to worry about, close quote. So there you have it in a nutshell. Mad leftists win, watch out. If you read a little deeper, you might get a bit more of a fuller picture. After 5 years of recession and cuts, 1.3 million Greeks, some 26% of the workforce, are without a job. Wages are down by 38%, pensions by 45%. Almost a third of Greeks are living below the poverty line and have no health insurance. Running on a pledge to roll back spending cuts and renegotiate Greece's loans, Tsipras's victory is generally described as a protest vote or a vote against austerity, which it certainly was. But there's a bit more to it than that, and it's interesting. On the Laura Flanders show, we had a chance to talk with a member of Syriza's Central Committee, Yanis Bournos. Last year, he told us that it's not charismatic speeches from balconies that win support, it's concrete help. Syriza's offered a good deal of that in the last few years. As we've reported in the past on the program, a solidarity movement has grown up in Greece during this crisis. It runs some 400 health clinics, cooperative kitchens, and what they call food solidarity centers. When the first Syriza members were elected to Parliament in 2012, they voted to give 20% of their monthly salary to that movement. And as of this August, Bournos said that Syriza volunteers were participating in 150 networks of local solidarity, offering everything from free drugs to free legal advice. Left or right, effective leadership is important, but it's possible, just possible, that Greek voters were swayed less by one guy's charisma than by hundreds of volunteers with a daily presence in their neighborhood. If we looked at politics that way in this country, how would our parties rate? Maybe there's a reason U.S. media prefer to stick to the surface. Tell me what you think. Write to me, Laura, Laura, @grittv.org. And thanks.